Welcome everybody to this special edition of Pizza and Perspectives. This one is in partnership with MasonVotes. The topic is trust, expectations, behaviors, and factors that influence voting. My name is Michael Galvin, and I welcome each one of you to this space. Pizza and Perspectives is a signature program of university life, and the goal is to involve students, faculty, and alumni across disciplines in meaningful and rational dialogue on relevant topics. Historically, these events were in person, where university life would provide the pizza and the soda to participants, therefore the pizza in the perspectives. In this time of pandemic, we've moved to a virtual format. We find this virtual format works very well with meaningful dialogue, but not so much with giving out free pizza and soda. So we welcome all of our participants to partake in their own pizza or whatever other refreshments while engaging from home. If you have questions for the panel, please feel free to type your question in the Q&A box, which you can access by clicking on the Q&A icon in the menu at the bottom of your screen. This is a discussion, so please do not shy away from asking a question or sharing your thoughts during the discussion. So I'm going to have our panelists introduce themselves to you. First of all, Jennifer Victor, tell us about yourself.
Hi, everyone. I'm Jennifer Victor. I'm an associate professor of political science here in the Schar School, where I research and teach classes broadly in American politics, American political institutions, specializing in the US Congress, political parties, campaign finance, lobbying, other aspects of politics that are a little bit broken right now. This semester, I'm teaching classes in Introduction to American Politics and a special course on the 2020 elections, focusing a little bit more on political behavior. In real life, I do a lot of political analysis in a lot of different venues for forward-facing or media-facing outlets. I blog regularly with an outlet called The Mischiefs of Faction, which is an independent political science blog about parties and politics. I also serve on the board of directors of the Center for Responsive Politics, which is a nonprofit, nonpartisan group in town. If you've ever looked up any data about campaign finance, you've probably used their data. They're at opensecrets.org or .com. I should probably know that. In any case, I'm really excited to be here and to have a discussion about this really important election that's going on. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, Jennifer. Thank you so much for being here. Gary Scott, do you want to tell us about yourself?
Figure out how to unmute this silly thing. I'm Gary Scott. I'm the Director of Elections and General Registrar for Fairfax County, Virginia. I've been the General Registrar for 2.5 years. Prior to that, I was 22 years as the Deputy General Registrar in the agency. And prior to that, I retired from the Navy. I'm originally from Western Texas. Although I've been living in Virginia for over 40 years, I still consider my home to be Western Texas. As I said, I'm a Navy retiree. I retired in 1994 and then came to work for the Office of Elections. And in my spare time, I rescue West Highland white terriers.
That's
something I would not recommend to a group as a whole unless you are willing to put up with a great deal of activity.
Thank you, Gary. And thank you so much for being here. Justin, do you want to tell us about yourself?
Sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Justin Gest. I'm an associate professor of policy and government at Mason's Schar School of Policy and Government. And my research looks at the politics of immigration and demographic change. And so I do study US politics quite closely, but I study it in comparative perspective with other countries around the world. My work has been published in a variety of different platforms, but in terms of the most public platforms, I regularly publish commentaries and op-eds in a variety of places like Politico, CNN, The Guardian, Reuters, the LA Times, and elsewhere.
Thank you, Justin. And thank you for being here. Karrie, you want to tell us about yourself?
Hi, everyone. I'm Karrie Delaney. I'm the delegate in the Virginia House of Delegates representing the 67th District, which is parts of Fairfax and Loudoun County. I was elected in 2017, which was obviously a pretty exciting year to be elected to office. I did, however, decide to run before the 2016 presidential elections. A lot of my colleagues who were elected the same year as me ran in response to the outcome of the 2016 elections, whereas I'd already made the decision to run and had a much different idea of what I thought my campaign was going to need to look like going into a 2017 election. So it's been very interesting as a candidate for office to have run a campaign in that particular year and then continue to watch the landscape change over these last several years and then coming into this nationwide election this year. So I look forward to talking with you more, and I appreciate the chance to be here tonight.
Thank you. Thank you for joining us, Karrie. And I'd like to introduce our moderator for this evening. Shauna Regard is a cultural studies PhD candidate at George Mason University. She was a community organizer for 10 years in Boston, working with youth and neighborhood development before joining us at Mason. Shauna, it's all yours.
Yeah, thanks so much for that introduction. It's always hard trying to find the mute button when you've got all kinds of things up. Super excited about moderating this conversation. Again, for the folks that have joined us, if you have any questions, feel free to type them in the Q&A box in Zoom. I'll also be looking at the chat too, if there's some conversation happening there. We've got some questions that we have for our panelists that we're super excited to hear some of their perspectives, even though it is without pizza. So feel free at any point in the conversation to pop in some questions for us, and we'll have some questions here, and hopefully we get a really great discussion. So I wanted to start off because it's Thursday, and we've got our third, or rather second, debate tonight. So I wanted to actually start off this conversation with talking about the debates, right? And a lot of the conversation that we've seen sort of on the news has been sort of, at this point, folks have made up their minds, right? And you know, and sort of these debates may just be for show, but there are some strategies that each of the candidates are sort of working to doing in these debates. I wanted to talk about, or start off our conversation with you all sort of sharing a little bit about how we should use debates, right? Especially at a point where now sort of information is so is easy to get, right? Can you talk a little bit about the usefulness of debates and what people should be paying attention to if they plan on watching tonight?
Are you directing one in particular, or you just want people to jump in?
No, folks can jump in.
I guess I can start off a little bit and just say that I think it's a really worthwhile question to ask in the current day and age, what purpose or public benefit do debates serve? Particularly the first debate that we saw in this particular election cycle between Biden and Trump was such a catastrophe that it was really an unwatchable kind of television event. So it's fair to ask how that serves the public good or the public interest or the campaign. On the other hand, while information is very accessible these days, we really don't have any opportunities for the candidates to interact with one another and for the public to observe that interaction. And I do think there is good information in observing those interactions. As unwatchable as that first debate was, it was also relatively revealing about the candidates themselves and about what they were trying to accomplish. And so to that extent, I do think it serves a public purpose to some extent. I think that, for the most part, the people who tune into these things are just the political junkies like us who get a kick out of this stuff and want to see what's going on, or the hardcore partisans who are coming to watch their team play as like a sport. And it's fair to say that as a public event whose ostensible purpose is to help people decide how they're going to vote, like that's just a fantasy. That's not really what's going on. But that doesn't mean they don't serve a purpose or that they're not beneficial to the public campaign or to public information that, that people might take with them to the ballot box.
What I would add to that too is that 2020 is a unique year, right? So it's not every campaign cycle that people have such ossified views of both candidates. So Joe Biden has been in politics for almost half a century. Donald Trump is one of the most polarizing figures in American political history. People generally know how they feel about both of these folks by now. But in other elections where you have a newcomer running, a dark horse winning a nomination, often the views are not that well set in stone. And so debates are actually incredibly valuable. We're just in a particular political moment where they're not as helpful. However, debates are not necessarily about persuasion, particularly when people are so already persuaded. Very few persuadable undecided voters remain. The idea that there are very many undecided voters left in American politics in any case is very much up for debate in any case. But debates can be very helpful for motivation purposes. So candidates' roles here are not necessarily to persuade, but rather to actually try to mobilize people to go out to the polls, to take it seriously, and to be passionate. So sorry, we have an infiltration in my home. In any case, and then this is Valentina. In any case,
What's this, Daddy?
okay, I'm going to pause and I'm going to pass things over to Delegate Delaney, and I'll come back with my final thought. Yeah.
And I'm waiting for that moment myself. I keep hearing sounds outside the door and I'm like, did I lock it? I don't know. So that could happen too. Welcome to 2020. So yeah, I think those points were all very accurate from my experience of having been a candidate. And, you know, my experience is on the much more local level. And I can say that people who come to a state legislature debate or a county supervisor debate mostly know who they're voting for. And as was said, you know, they're kind of there to support their candidate or to, you know, just be really political nerds and, you know, eat the popcorn, right? And watch what we have to say. So I think it's very true that, you know, up and down the ballot, debates probably are a lot less about persuasion than they are about kind of just getting your base rallied up and ready, because they're either going to hear things from you that they really like, and that's going to help motivate them to, you know, go out and knock doors or campaign and, you know, be part of your movement. Or they're going to hear your opponent say something, you know, really awful, and that will be also motivating. So I think, you know, campaigns look at it as, you know, yes, hopefully in an ideal world, people are going to be informed. They're going to listen to the content. They're going to hear, you know, what unique ideas you have and what passion you're bringing, and they'll make up their mind about who they're going to vote for. But I do think that in reality, they, at all levels of government, really serve more as a motivational tool and kind of as a, you know, it inspires more of an action than voting, beyond voting.
Mm-hmm. Awesome.
The other point that I was going to add before I was so rudely interrupted is that, and by the way, that's obviously the parents' fault, right? Because I should have locked the door. The other point that I was going to add is that, you know, people don't have to watch the debate, to watch the whole hour and a half or whatever it's going to be in order to actually watch the debate. Really what matters is the highlights, right? So people are going to read about the major moments, the, you know, the fly that appears on Mike Pence's head. You know, it's going to be, those are the things that people talk about the next day. It's not going to be the mundane policy details. So, you know, even though there may not be that many people watching, you know, all hour and a half of it or all 2 hours of it, and they may not be watching the pregame and the postgame shows and everything, what really matters is these kind of pivotal moments where the American public really understands the public official or the candidate and can get an understanding about his or her temperament, his or her approach to governance and office holding. And I think that in the sort of social media environment, that's what matters. People are going to give you about 30 seconds of their attention, and what you do with it is really key.
Awesome. Thank you so much for that.
I just hope that everyone doesn't remember the 30 seconds when my daughter came in.
I think we all do, because that is sort of just what 2020 is, right?
That's the fly on my head.
Right, right. I think that this question is has also opened up conversation about sort of the changes in some of the debate rules. We actually have a question in the Q&A about sort of this conversation about sort of the mics and muting of mics during the debate tonight. And even thinking about sort of the role of the moderator. And I hope that I am able to be a great example of that today. But whether or not sort of how much control do moderators have as a part of the debate, and sort of how they're able to sort of navigate the conversation between these two candidates.
I'm so glad, Shauna, that you added that second part onto that question, because that's something I've been talking about with my students. And I might be in the minority on this opinion, but you know, the moderators of the debates that we've seen so far have taken a ton of criticism for not controlling the speakers or the candidates very well. And I have to say that I'm not sure that that's the moderator's job, or if it is the moderator's job, I'm not totally sure how they can do that. You know, if Donald Trump is intent on being disruptive and interrupting, I'm not sure that a moderator alone could do something about that. And so, I mean, it's fair to critique them and talk about other strategies that maybe they could have used. And, you know, to the extent that we might expect moderators to do sort of fact checking in real time, I mean, I think that can get dicey, and that we should have reasonable expectations about that. But I don't know that in the first debate, for example, any other moderator other than Quist Wallace could have changed that whole scenario in a much different way that would have made the whole event much different. So I do think moderators are important to some extent, and I do think that we have, you know, a moderator that is both knowledgeable and asks good questions and listens and sort of repeats or is a little responsive back and forth is helpful, and it makes the debate a more interactive experience. But I'm not sure that we should blame moderators too much for candidates who are intent on going off the rails, I guess. And on the mic thing, I have to say I'm of two minds of that as well. On the one hand, like, thank God, like, it's going to be a slightly better experience. But my understanding of how the Debate Commission has negotiated this is that the debate is broken up into like 5 or 6 different policy segments. And the candidates will each get 2 minutes at the top of each one of those blocks where their opponent's mic is turned off. But then as that segment goes on, the mics will be on. So I think we'll still get plenty of disruption and plenty of that sort of bickering back and forth stuff going on. Probably not quite as much as we did in the first debate. But that might be the best of both worlds, because if the mics were completely controlled, then in a way, the viewers are not getting sort of the true taste of what the candidates are trying to put out there and what they're trying to display about themselves. So there is, as sort of uncomfortable as it is to watch, there is a sort of honesty to it that in some ways I think is informative.
And I'll add that, you know, I think candidates, especially when you're talking at the national level, I mean, they're prepped, you know, they have rehearsed, they know what they're going to say, no matter what the question is. Like, they've been prepped. They have talking points that they are going to be intent to make sure that people hear. And so I think a moderator does have a real opportunity to ask questions in a way and ask follow-ups in a way that if you can, you know, if you can get somebody to kind of go off script a little bit and really reveal an honest, kind of genuine, maybe not so much honest, but, you know, a more authentic answer, I guess it would be the right way to say that. I think that can be very telling, because, you know, it's one thing to kind of spit back the talking point that's been memorized than it is to just sort of speak as yourself and allow the public to really just see you for a genuine, you know, who you genuinely are. And I think that, you know, that goes a lot for sort of the trust that people have in their elected officials, is feeling like they're really seeing the authentic person and not sort of a prepped facade.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I think that sort of the conversation about the debates also in terms of sort of the purpose and how folks find it useful, not only just for sort of rallying behind their candidate, but I think that we have used debates to sort of hear things that we were waiting for, to be able to interact with candidates. And I think that one of the things that has sort of again been circulating around sort of this election and our last presidential election is the amount of misinformation, right, that comes up. And I think that whether it's from sort of this angle of Russian interference, or be it social media algorithms, right? There's sort of this question about like, how do people parse through all of this information that they're seeing in social media, on the news, right? To actually move out of whatever echo chambers that they might be in, to get some facts that are that tell the story of the candidate that they're interested in voting for, that have policies that they're interested in. How do folks parse through all of this stuff to get to the real information about who they want to vote for? That was a hard question.
You know, I think Jen is actually most qualified to answer these kinds of questions, actually.
Yeah.
I was feeling self-conscious about always talking first.
Well,
so I often give.
Go ahead.
Yeah, so I have some sort of like specific advice that I give people on exactly this question, like how to avoid being in your own echo chamber and making sure you're getting accurate information. And it involves a couple of strategies. So one is to try not to get your news from television. So by and large, television news kind of sucks. And it's designed to stimulate senses and reactions in ways that are not necessarily always the most holistic. And so reading your news is better than watching your news. Second, it's good to have a variety in your news diet. So if your news diet includes the same sources, whether it's the same television channel or the same particular websites or something like that over and over again, you might want to think about finding an aggregator or some other strategy to make sure there's a little bit of variety in the types of news sources that you're getting. Third, I really encourage folks to look at the sources that they're listening to and decide if those are sources that are following the best journalistic norms and practices of the profession, right? So there's a lot of outlets out there that claim to be doing journalism or news reporting. But there's a difference between the high quality ones and the low quality ones. And some of the things we should be looking for are the news sources you're listening to, do they clearly delineate what's news from what's opinion? If the op-eds and the news are all just sort of meshed together and it's hard to tell which site you're on or which person is speaking in which category, then that's no good. You want sources that are clearly delineating between these two things. You want sources that when they make mistakes, they report the errata, like they're recognizing and publicly correcting when they've made errors, because everybody makes errors. You want sources that are linking to other sources that are high quality sources and that are following the best journalistic practices for making sure that sources are verified and that, double checking facts and this type of thing. And so we can all do our part to make sure that the things that we're listening to are following these types of best practices. And then frankly, don't get all your news from social media. If all of your news is coming from, particularly Facebook is quite frankly the worst offender here. And a very high percentage of Americans are actually getting almost all of their news from Facebook these days. But we have good research that shows that the way the Facebook newsfeed works these days, or not these days, but the way it's always worked, is, you get the cat videos and the kid videos, and then you get the politics, and it's all just right in there mixed together. And the cat videos and the cute kid pictures like stimulate the emotional part of your brain. And then when you get the politics that comes up right after that, it's like the emotional part of your brain is already stimulated and you wind up reacting to the political information with an emotional point of view rather than from the rational part of your brain. And so the way the Facebook newsfeed works is it makes us have a more emotional reaction to politics than maybe we perhaps should. So I often try to train my students to read the news, read lots of news, and try to engage with it in a dispassionate way. like try to read it and not be outraged or moved, or try to go into it with a sense of curiosity and with the goal of being informed rather than with the goal of being angered or moved or something like that. And it's really hard. It's very difficult these days, the way that the information environment works. But it's sort of at this point, because it's so frankly unregulated, it's incumbent upon us to try to take personal responsibility for it.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, I would add that, you have to be your own algorithm, because what Facebook is doing and other sources of news feed, whether it's Apple News or otherwise, is that they want you to click. And so they're going to use your previous history of clicking to present you with information that you are more likely to click on. And so what happens is that it whittles things down, ever reinforcing you into a sort of spiral form, into a very specific form of news with a specific angle. And it creates that silo. The algorithm creates the silo. And so you have to be your own algorithm. You have to be the one that checks different news sites and curates your own reading, by just skimming the headlines and seeing what's interesting to you. Definitely, reiterating what Jen said about reading multiple sources is very important. In this era, you have to be conscious of accountability, because anyone can throw a website up. And it's really about what organizations are accountable, whether to an ombudsman or to some sort of authority that's actually checking what they're doing. Any place that does not cite their sources with hyperlinks, that's usually a bad sign. Places that don't publish errata or errors, as Jennifer mentioned, is a bad sign. And you should click hyperlinks. Look at what the basis of the statement or the assertion is, and if it's not coming from government research, peer-reviewed research by nonpartisan, neutral organizations and think tanks that actually are reputable, then you shouldn't trust it. And we have to be our own best filters. And the tough thing, of course, Shauna, is that not everyone has the time to do this. We professors, we're basically paid to read all day. So we have the time to cull through the news. So if that's the case and you don't have the time to be your own filter and to be your own algorithm, then you want to identify regularly trustworthy sources to rely upon, preferably more than one, that you then go to, rather than allowing the internet to just present them to you. Clickbait is a very dangerous way, but it is precisely how news is being made these days.
Yeah, thank you for that. There's actually another question in the chat about recommendations for good news sources, websites or print media that folks might find helpful to help them sort of move past where they are.
That's so funny. I hadn't seen the question in the chat, but I was starting, or in the Q&A, but I was just starting to type something into the chat to answer this exact question. That's really good. So I would recommend New York Times, Washington Post, Wall Street Journal, USA Today, Time Magazine, LA Times, Yahoo News is okay. That's probably my best short list. Politico isn't bad. But again, some of these sources can get close to the don't differentiate opinion from news items. You definitely want to try to be conscious of that. But if I was going to make my top list, like those are the places that I go to first for quality news. But I'd be interested to hear what some of the other panelists rely upon.
I agree with everything that you just, all the sources, and I read those regularly. What I would add is a few international sources of news. Too often we look at US politics through this tunnel vision of America, and we are such a unique country in so many unfortunate ways, in other really wonderful ways, but other very unfortunate ways. And it's important to know what other countries are doing because we learn so much from what other countries are doing. So I would recommend checking out the Financial Times, which George Mason University has a subscription to. It's free anytime you want. The Economist, which George Mason University has a subscription to. It's free anytime you want. Really sophisticated work. BBC News, which you don't need a subscription to. It's free. So those are three sources that any Mason affiliate has immediate access to, which are all absolutely fabulous sources of news. Domestically, I would mention NPR as another source of news that Jen did not mention. After that, what Jen is referring to about the sort of blurring between news and commentary is really important. You don't want to mask these two together, of course, but then you get into the space of what's called news analysis. And news analysis is, it has an angle on the news. It takes an analytical view of the news. It's not journalism in the sense that it's not reporting information that has not already been reported, but it's synthesizing a lot of information, bringing it together, usually with an angle or an argument associated with it. And good news analysis is not necessarily, is not ideological. So it should be based on fact and reality, even if it has a bias in some kind of way. But those are often very valuable to read. And I would actually check out news analysis on places like The Atlantic. I would look at The New Yorker. And I would also look at Politico for news analysis. Those are three really good sources. And the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Wall Street Journal all also publish news analyses as well.
Awesome. Thanks so much for that. I want to move from sort of talking about how we get information and sort of how we're thinking about voting to the actual process itself. And I wanted to sort of pose this next question to Gary Scott, right? I think that with COVID-19, we've sort of had a number of opportunities for folks to sort of vote by mail. Early voting has been happening. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about folks, or talk a little bit to sort of folks who are hesitant about sort of the voting by mail, and what folks should know if they're choosing to vote by mail, that would help to ensure some confidence. And folks can feel free afterwards to sort of jump in too with some history or how we can sort of think about this process of voting by mail and early voting.
Well, the whole dynamic in the Commonwealth of Virginia has changed since the last presidential election. This past session of the General Assembly, they enacted no excuse absentee voting prior to this time. Voting early, it was absentee voting. There was no early voting. You had to have a reason why you couldn't go to the polling place. That combined with concerns people have about going to the polling places and the very unsettled political climate has driven a great deal of interest to voting early. Now, with respect to voting by mail, if you haven't applied for a ballot by mail, it's almost too late because the application must be received in our office by 5 p.m. tomorrow in order to get a ballot by mail. That having said, we've issued 260,000 ballots here, which is a third of our total number of active registered voters, and combined with the over 100,000 people we've had vote absent early vote in person, we're looking that we've already gotten about 55% of the total anticipated turnout we were expecting for this election. Turnout in Fairfax County for presidential elections is generally high. It was 83.2% in 2016. We were expecting, and still are expecting, up to a 90% turnout this year, which equates to just about 650,000 people voting. And we're right at the 330,000 ballots either requested or actively voted. I know there's various groups have stirred the pot, as it will, to cast doubt on the viability of voting by mail, especially with respect to the Postal Service. In a special session of the General Assembly this last year, they did authorize us to use drop boxes for the first time for this election. So we have received just over 40,000 ballots in our drop boxes, most of which came into the 2 drop boxes we have here at the Government Center. But we're still getting approximately 6,000 ballots a day returned by that. And that's always the option that people have for returning the ballots. Not only the drop boxes we have here and at the early voting sites, but there will be a drop box at every polling place, all 243 polling places we have. And we're anticipating that between 20 and 25,000 people will in fact return their ballots at those drop boxes on election day. And then the General Assembly this year did also extend the return period for ballots through noon on the following Friday after the election. Which will be a challenge because we're anticipating we will have, when we work in the ballots that we will receive by mail late, the ballots we will receive from the polling place, we're looking at counting 40 to 50,000 ballots in a 2.5-day period of time, which we can do. I mean, but people have become accustomed to having election results on election night. Don't look for any final results until Sunday. It just ain't gonna happen. We will report what we have at 11 p.m., but they're going to be incomplete. So people are going to have to adjust the way they think about how they get election results, as well as adjust the way of how they show up for voting.
Registrar Scott, can you tell us why even report the results at 11 p.m.?
I'm sorry?
Why even report the results at 11 p.m.?
The direction we received from the Virginia Department of Elections in Richmond was to continue counting on election night until we had either completed the count or 11 p.m., whichever came first. The people that are doing this counting have already been there since 5 a.m. and we don't, and quite honestly, just like any other poll workers, they generally come from an older demographic. And so we run the risk of an increasing level of mistakes the longer we keep people there. Plus the fact we know we're not going to have everything counted. So we just, an arbitrary stopping point before we start again the next day.
Right. No, I wasn't suggesting that we press these volunteers until 3 a.m. What I was wondering is why even report at all? You know, I think that, you know, so much of the trouble around the upcoming election results is that there is a conventional American expectation that we'll know the outcome by the following day. And with all the absentee ballots cast, and you know, because as you say, we won't know the full result till Sunday, why even tease the American people into what the result might be until Sunday? Why don't you think states are just waiting until Sunday and say, we'll let you know when it's final, so that no candidate can declare victory early and prematurely?
I think a lot of it has to do with the volume that we're looking at. Every state is seeing a huge increase in early and absentee voting by mail, and not to report anything. The lack of information is just as suspicious to many people as incomplete information, and especially with our situation here in Fairfax. It's quite obvious Fairfax is the largest locality in the Commonwealth. But if you were to separate our absentee precinct, in Virginia, Fairfax uses a central absentee precinct, and just separate that out and create that as its own separate locality, it would be the largest locality in the Commonwealth of Virginia. And I don't see that we could really get by without reporting at least some results from the largest block of voters in the Commonwealth.
If Shauna doesn't mind, and maybe Jen wants to also add something, but I recently just authored a commentary with CNN, and it was a commentary, not news. And you know, one of the things I was arguing for is that states should actually set expectations in advance for when results will be announced, so that neither candidate can declare premature victory, and then also potentially declare premature fraud in case they lose. And I wonder if we are not setting ourselves up with this degree or this interest in transparency at least short-run transparency. We're actually not setting ourselves up for long-run democratic troubles. Jen, did you want to say something maybe related? I'm sorry.
I wanted to ask a much more pragmatic question. Mr. Scott, I was wondering if you can tell us how is your office doing in keeping up with the volume that you've got so far in terms of the number of ballots that you've already received? So when election day comes, will you essentially be caught up to the ballots you've received at that point, or will you still be counting?
Virginia law allows us to pre-process ballots as we receive. So we run the ballots through the scanners every day. We have 2 high-speed scanners, which each can process 300 or scan and record 300 ballots a minute. We're doing this every day. We will,
Dennis, is that right?
I'm sorry?
I understand you've named the machine Dennis. Is that right?
I'm sorry, I still couldn't hear you.
I read someplace that the machine got named and somebody had named it Dennis.
We have Dennis and Denise. We've always had one, and we purchased a second one in anticipation of the load that we're going to get. But the manufacturer's designation of these machines is DS850. So DS became Denise, and then when we got the second one, it became Dennis. But we will have completed, we've scanned everything that we have received to date. And we will continue, we will scan the Sunday before the election. Traditionally, we don't get much mail on the Mondays at all, because we will be getting mail deliveries on Saturday here. The staff here has been working 7-day weeks for the last 10 weeks. So there will be here people processing the mail. So we're basically on election day be scanning what we receive on Monday and what we will get on Tuesday. We've arranged for 2 mail deliveries instead of the normal one that we get. So we expect a fairly heavy load. But I actually anticipate we will have, by 11 p.m., have the vast majority of what we have received scanned and ready to report.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I guess that was the follow-up question. Maybe you mostly answered it, but I wanted to ask. It seems to me that your expectation that we wouldn't know the results in Virginia until Sunday doesn't match up all that well with the idea that more than half of the vote has already come in and been counted. I know that absentee ballots take a lot longer to process than those that are cast in person, but maybe you could just clarify that for me. And also, I guess there's of course a difference between the final certified vote, that is when it's all said and done, versus the vote where we sort of pretty much know who the winner is going to be based on the margins.
Well, if we are looking at what we anticipate getting back to around 20 to 25,000 returned at our polling places on election day, none of those are going to be counted on election day. Those are going to be counted after that. We're also looking at 15 to 20,000 coming in the mail on Monday and Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday morning. And that is a significant part of our turnout. We are going to have incomplete results on election night, and it may demonstrate which way the results are trending, but we're not going to have true final unofficial returns until we've done everything. And that's not only the late returned absentee ballots, but we will also have 3,000 to 4,000 provisional ballots that we can't even begin looking at until we've completed the count of the absentees. And then once that's done, those are still unofficial until the state meets the following week to certify the results. There is no official winner.
I think that this part of the conversation is exactly sort of where we were headed anyway. So appreciate sort of these other questions from Dr. Gest and Victor. The other sort of question that comes out is like, because we may not have official results, right, in the ways in which we typically or tend to have, right, what might be the outcome, right, of sort of this doubt on the election potentially, right? This doubt on the election if we don't have these official results. Are folks worried about that? Is that something that we've had to deal with historically? What do folks see as potential issues that might come up if we are looking at unofficial results into the Sunday, depending on, right, the state, the electoral votes? What might that what are folks thinking about or have been thinking about?
Well, a lot of people on this call might be too young to remember, but the election in 2000 was a mess. And we didn't know the outcome of that election for a good 5 weeks until after Election Day. But there's a couple of big differences. There's two big differences between the year 2000 and the year 2020 when it comes to this. And one is that the electorate in 2020 is much more partisan and much more polarized than it was 20 years ago. 20 years ago, when we had this delayed result in this very close election, people, there was some hemming and hawing, but people were mostly peaceful. There were no big protests in the streets. I mean, people were a little tense, like it was uneasy, but everybody seemed to think that it was gonna work out somehow. There was no like the union is falling kind of rhetoric going on. But these days, with heightened partisanship, and then the other characteristic that's different is elite messaging. So political psychologists will often talk about this phenomenon of elite messaging. And by elites, we mean elected people usually. And here we're mostly talking about Donald Trump, like the sitting president, because his rhetoric is often very divisive and very inflammatory. And he may be likely to go around sowing doubt and discord about a delayed election in a way that's not necessary, and in a way that may not reflect whatever the facts on the ground are. And that to me is concerning. So a combination of troubling elite messaging and partisan polarization could make a delayed election result an unsettling time.
Just to elaborate on that point, in the 2000 election, the third party candidate, Ralph Nader, referred to George W. Bush and Al Gore as Tweedledee and Tweedledum. And I think he was referring to Bush as the Tweedledum. In any case, the point was that they weren't actually all that different. He thought that his perspective as a Green Party candidate was that very little separated the Democratic and the Republican nominee. No one would make that mistake today. And so the stakes are higher as a result, because the difference in the candidate who would be the president are so stark. So it's not just that you have a polarized country, it's also that you have just two polar opposite candidates in many ways. Even though Joe Biden actually is not necessarily the best reflection of that polarity. In fact, quite the opposite. He's an endangered species. He sees himself as a very bipartisan person who has spent his career reaching across the aisle. At least that's the image he wants to fashion. So even with that kind of candidate, there are still enormous differences between them. And so the stakes are going to feel higher. The kind of rhetoric that Jen is concerned about is of concern from a bipartisan perspective. The Bipartisan Transition Integrity Project has produced reports recently that is fearful that the Trump campaign may prematurely declare victory and baselessly before the actual results come in and are made official by people like Mr. Scott here. And there is precedent for this, but it's just not in the United States. It's in a lot of third world countries, in competitive authoritarian or even dictatorships where you see this. This was the case recently in Guyana, a country that I recently wrote a commentary about for Foreign Policy magazine, where you had this kind of premature and dubious declaration of victory by an incumbent. These are not strong democracies. These are young democracies. In some cases, these are non-democracies where you've seen this take place. And if anyone here has not yet read it, to demonstrate the virtue of good comparative political perspectives, it's worth reading the New York Times bestseller by my former mentor, Steve Levitsky, and Dan Ziblatt, How Democracies Die. because they demonstrate, they put some of these techniques into comparative perspective among other authoritarian or competitive authoritarian regimes.
Thank you. As you all were talking, we've got a couple of questions in the chat that I did want to point out there. One question that Mr. Scott alluded to in terms of talking about sort of the ballots that are already coming in and the projection of those ballots. But for you all, do you think that because of this sort of this partisan streak through this particular election, are you seeing that there might be more participation this election? And in terms of young people, right? Do you feel like there has been a push to get more young people to the ballot? Does anyone have a sense of what's happening with GMU students? And I think that sort of college students are also in a really interesting space because some of them are still registered at home and may not put in do their absentee ballot, or what do you all see is happening in terms of the push to the polls and the push to the polls for young people?
Professor Victor is leading such an effort herself right now. She's perfect to discuss this.
Awesome.
I am actually. I created an organization, and maybe I'll go grab the link in a second, called Democracy Squad. That is a bipartisan effort, or nonpartisan, I should say, effort to get students, or not just students, but staff, faculty, alumni, any Mason affiliate, to engage about the election in positive ways. There's so much negativity and sort of aggressiveness surrounding this election. I wanted to make sure students felt like they knew how to get involved and how to encourage one another in positive ways. And it's run where students can propose their own projects, or like get people to vote, or chalk up the campus, or different things like that. But to answer your question more directly, in 2018, in 2016, George Mason, the voter turnout among George Mason students was around 63%. So we have a good history of strong voter turnout among Mason population. And by all accounts, based on recent data that I've seen, we should expect that number to go up this year. And so the voter turnout at large in the country in 2018 was the highest voter turnout for a midterm election that the United States has seen in more than 100 years. So we had more than 55% voter turnout for a midterm election. And a lot of that uptick was among young people. The voter turnout among young people, it's still low, but in relative terms, they were pretty low to begin with. So going up a little bit is a big percentage-wise uptick. But all of that suggests that we will have very strong voter turnout in 2020. And on the one hand, that's really great. Like, you can't have a democracy without elections, and getting people out there and voting is really great. On the other hand, there is something about it has a bittersweetness to it for me, because I think one of the reasons voter turnout is so high is because of the polarization, is because people fear that if their political opponent wins, if their side loses, that the country will be destroyed, that all will be lost. The costs of losing go up as polarization increases. And that's what's driving some of the enthusiasm for voter participation. And in some ways, that is a sad statement about some democratic decline that we've experienced in the United States. So I kind of have a little bit of mixed feelings about it, I have to be honest with you.
Yeah.
And I can comment just, what I've seen kind of on the ground in the grassroots movements here in Virginia is definitely a notable increase in participation, not just in voting, but in political participation of formerly less involved populations. And that does include, the younger demographic, also just, folks who maybe otherwise weren't that political. They didn't really have the opportunity to know too much about the candidates or who exactly was on the ballot because, they're working full time and they've got their kids and their family, and it's not on their radar. Who's running for local office. They say, oh, I go and vote on presidential years, but I don't really know who else is running for what. A lot of those people in the last several years have really become very engaged and not only started voting regularly, but also started getting involved in campaigns and coming out and supporting candidates and knocking doors for candidates, making calls for candidates. And so I think we've seen this really big swing in engagement and participation, and that includes young people as well. I know on my campaigns we've had a huge amount of support from student organizations and student groups, and not just people looking for internships, though we always accept that as well, but just people who are interested in helping and getting involved, and have that sense of I can make a difference and I can support a candidate that I believe in, and that's really going to make a difference. And I would say that especially at the local level, yes, it will. That knocking a packet of doors can actually make the difference between who wins a local election. And on the national scale, I think just being a part of something that you believe in is accessible to people, and we're seeing a big increase in that over the last several years.
Great. So I think there's another question in the chat about sort of the integrity of our elections and our election processes, and we've talked a little bit about that. The question is like, what are the procedures of states, of different localities that help to enhance the integrity of our elections? And I wonder, Mr. Scott, maybe you can start us off here, sort of how your office may work to think about sort of those election procedures that are created, right? That ensure election integrity. Again, this conversation about sort of like trusting our process.
Well, a couple of things. Virginia is pretty much, as far as voting procedures and rules, is a top-down state. We operate in a very restricted, not restricted, but a very well-defined area of what we are allowed and not allowed to do. But I think one of the most important things that people need to take into account when discussing the integrity of elections, the people who are conducting these elections are your neighbors. These are people that you work with, that you live with. Election day on November the 3rd will be one of the largest volunteer operations in history. There will be millions of ordinary citizens turning out to work that. In Fairfax, we've enrolled 4,300 poll workers. We're only planning on deploying 3,800, but we've recruited 4,300 who are available to do this. And again, these are people from the community who have a vested interest in ensuring that the results are fair and accurate. We used to have a sign up in our office, which was a quote from a Virginia Supreme Court ruling. Elections don't have to be perfect, but they have to be fair. And that is the goal that we shoot for. There's suspicious times. It's an uncertain world, and we would all hope for better things. If it were a perfect world, we wouldn't need elections in the first place. But people should feel confident, because it's the guy who lives across the street from them is the guy working in the polling place.
Yeah. Dr. Victor?
I want to add, if I could, one observation that might be helpful to those who are thinking about election legitimacy is that we don't hold a national election in the United States for anything. We only hold state and local elections. Even the president is elected using the Electoral College, which is just aggregated state level votes, right? So we don't have one election. There is, yes, a national election day, but we hold thousands of simultaneous local elections at the same time on election day. And in state by state and county by county, the election administration and the rules and the balloting and all of that differs because of the federal structure of our system. And while to some extent that might be frustrating, it's also an incredible sign of resilience, right? It's really hard to hack an election where there's 50,000 different, ballots being used and systems of counting and rules about which absentee ballots can go where and so forth. And so the decentralized nature of our system in some ways provides a sense of security and robustness that I think to some extent might make people feel better who are concerned about those things. It has some downsides too, but it has that upside.
Yeah, yeah, awesome. So this next question I have is for Delegate Delaney. And so it's this question, and I'm gonna see if we have time for two more questions before we close up. But the question is, can you talk about the importance of down ballot elections and discuss the county level political engagement?
Yeah, I mean, I think down ballot elections are, I would make the argument, are going to impact the average citizen's life probably more in many cases. Now we're in kind of uncharted territory right now, so maybe right up until now I could have said this, but typically the decisions that are being made at the state and local level are going to impact your everyday life a lot more than some of what we typically see at the federal level, at least faster, most of the time. Federal legislation, it's a slower moving ship. So, that's one of the things I love about working in state government is the bills we vote on in February become law that July, and you're seeing an impact in people's lives, hopefully for the better, because of legislation that you put forward. So I would make the argument that voting in your local elections when it's an off year and there's not a president on the ballot and there's not a congressperson on the ballot and there's maybe not even a governor on the ballot are still incredibly consequential. And I think that those are situations where your vote means so much, because we've even seen, as many of you I'm sure are that you're here tonight have probably been somewhat engaged in Virginia politics, know that just a few years ago, the seat near Virginia Beach came down to one vote, and we had to draw the name out of the bowl. And what's interesting about that is not only was that one seat determined by that one vote, but had a different name been pulled out, it would have actually changed the numbers of the party representation in Richmond and would have switched the power balance completely. So one vote, not only would have made a difference in that one seat, but would have also made a difference in which party took control of the House of Delegates that year. And so I think that, your vote always matters and your voice always matters. And this election year, so much is on the line. And I hope everybody has already voted or has a plan to vote. But I would say that the local elections, these things can come down to, well, obviously one, but even in other situations, tens of votes, 30, under 100 votes. It makes such a difference. Turnout it makes an incredible difference to have the turnout, and getting an extra 100 people to the polls can make the difference between one candidate versus another candidate. It is such an incredibly tiny margin that these elections are so important, and that driving that turnout is just absolutely critical.
How do we get folks to turn out for these smaller right elections? How do we get them to turn out?
I mean, I'd love to know if other panelists have, some data or ideas or research maybe that what really works for people. But I know from a campaigner's perspective, for someone who's, worked to try to get people out, it takes a lot of, feet on the ground, boots on the ground efforts, knocking doors, making phone calls, and just working for it. You have to, get out there and talk to your neighbors, those face-to-face. And we'll see, campaigning in the time of COVID is of course a little different. So it'll be interesting to see what next year looks like. But, typically you're out there knocking on doors, and you're relying on your volunteers and your base of support to get out there and make those phone calls and to knock those doors with you and for your campaign, and just making sure that you're encouraging people to make a plan to vote. And I know you'll hear that a lot is, do you have a plan to vote? Especially that last week when we're in that final effort, you really want people to verbalize, yes, I have a plan. Yes, actually, I think I'll go, before work. So I'll go at 8 a.m. You want them to kind of just really think that through. So there are some techniques like that we've been encouraged to use, but I think it's a grassroots effort. It's a get out there and and walk your neighborhood and work for volunteer with the campaign to get out there knocking doors, making calls. I know everybody's phone's probably blowing up right now with texts about this candidate or that candidate, or who are you supporting, or can we count on your support? There's a lot more technology being used to get people engaged, but it's a lot of face-to-face and word of mouth, and just hoping people get the message that their voice matters.
In terms of the research, and Jen can elaborate on this even further, but I would say there's three big things that I've read about. This is not my own work. This is other people's, other social scientists' really good work. One is obviously shoe leather. The power of canvassing is obviously very important, and Delegate Delaney discussed that already. The second is accountability. So if people feel like they're being watched, if they feel social pressure, if they feel like their neighbor's going to find out if they're going to vote, that's where the stickers come in, you know, because people want to show that sticker. That's accountability, right? It actually, you know, people don't want to look bad. And so, oh, you're going to vote? Where's your sticker? You know, so stickers are little things like that are really important incentives. And then sadly, the top of the ticket matters, you know, and for states like Virginia that have off-year elections, the intensity gap is enormous. Primary voting rates are extremely depressed in the United States. It's pitiful. So you can be elected with a fraction of the constituency you represent participating, let alone supporting you, right? And that is just an incredible, you know, failure of democracy if you think about it. But yet that's exactly what democracy is in the United States. You know, from a comparative perspective, I will, you know, share with our viewers tonight that there are countries out there that have holidays on federal or national or state local holidays on election day, which is exactly what's going to be happening in Virginia this year. It's being declared a state holiday so that people don't have to work, at least if their employer is observing the holiday. So that doesn't get in the way of voting. There are countries out there that have mandatory voting. Belgium, Luxembourg, Australia. These are industrialized, Western, advanced democracies that require, that mandate that people vote. And for those of you who say, you know, that's a little bit of an infringement on my freedom, they don't say that you have to, you know, actually select a candidate. You can submit a spoiled ballot. You can choose none of the above if you want to. So no one's saying you have to pick someone, but everyone has to submit their vote. And that's in effect a way of communicating your preferences. And so it doesn't have to be this way. It's just the way it is right now.
Yeah, Dr. Victor?
Yeah, I'd want to plus one what Representative Delaney and Dr. Gest have just said. And also, I wanted to take a second to thank Representative Delaney for the work that the Virginia legislature has done over this last year to really expand voting rights in Virginia, especially in times of COVID. I think it's making a really big difference and a lot of really positive changes there. So thank you so much for the role that you've played in helping that to happen. It's a far change from, you know, Virginia's roots as a democracy. We've come a long way in some positive ways. And just to put a little bit of an umbrella on the excellent points that were just made, is to say that what the literature tells us about voting is that it's not an individual exercise. Voting is a social thing. And the reason the shoe leather and all that other stuff works is because you know, the reason people are more likely to vote when somebody else asks them to vote, when it's a person-to-person contact that says, will you please go vote, and what's your plan, and all this other stuff that people were talking about. And what we know about what people who are more likely to vote, you know, so frankly, the more educated you are, white people, the longer you've lived in your community, the more deep-rooted you feel in your community, the older you are, all of and economic status, all of these characteristics that are associated with voting, all of them to me speak to a sense of a network, right? So voting is about activating social networks. And the more work that we can do to expand what those networks are and help people to feel more included in the process of elections, then the more participation we get.
Dr. Gest, did you want to add something?
No, I think I had my say.
I saw your unmute. Okay, awesome. So we have just a couple more minutes, and I wanted to sort of ask this last question because I think that it sort of falls in line with what we've been talking about, right? Mobilizing folks, people going out to actually vote. One of the things that we've seen, particularly this year with early voting and COVID, right, being an experience, right, that we're living every day, is that there are these long lines, right, of people voting. We've been hearing about folks standing in line for 45 hours to 5 hours just to vote. And I think that one of those things that those pictures can sort of elicit is sort of like this feeling of sort of like being like, yes, this is beautiful, right? People are still invested in, right, this process, right? They're invested in democracy. And sort of the other emotion, right, is that this is a little scary, right? And it kind of feels like this might be voter suppression, right? That communities are disenfranchised. I wondered if you all could sort of pull our conversation together as we're sort of ending, right, our pizza and perspectives, to talk about how we make sense of what's happening with these long lines. How do we prevent them in the future? How do we ensure that everyone who wants to vote can vote?
Well, I'll mention, I appreciate the note of the work that the Virginia General Assembly's done this past year to help increase access to voting. I mean, this has been a priority for many of us for a long time, and it just so happens that the very timeliness of it, that a lot of the bills that we were able to pass before we realized what was coming in regards to COVID are also incredibly timely in the time of COVID, because we know that there's an added layer of, is it safe to go to the polls health-wise? Is it something where, I'm taking a risk to go to the polls? And so I think it's just another reason why we need to have options and flexibility to have people vote in this Commonwealth. And I think that, in terms of the long lines, I mean, I think it is a culmination of a lot of factors, and I'm sure others can speak more definitively to, to what specifically might be causing that. But I think, there are a lot of factors involved, but I think it also just speaks to the reason why it's so important that we have options, because imagine if that was condensed down to election day on a Tuesday. It requires a certain amount of privilege to be able to stand in line for a few hours on a work day, on the middle of the week. That's just something that the access to that, it's not everybody in the Commonwealth that's going to have the opportunity to, on a Tuesday, be able to stand in line for hours between 6 a.m. and 7 p.m. when they're working or have childcare needs. And so it really just speaks to, if you really want the voice of the people to be heard, you need to be able to offer a variety of safe and secure options so that the public has the opportunity to have their voice heard and to cast their ballot. And so that's something that I am very proud that we were able to finally accomplish, is expanding that access to voting with no excuse absentee voting, as well as some of the other provisions that allowed some more flexibility around registration and submitting your ballot to make sure that, the vote will be recorded, the vote will be safe. And you'll have the opportunity to vote in a variety of ways that I think will provide a lot broader access.
Awesome.
I don't have an enormous amount to say here. All I will add is that as our viewers are considering the kinds of democratic reforms that are being discussed these days, as it relates to electoral reform and the various ways that we want to improve our democracy, you want to just ask yourself two questions. One, is the reform being considered making it easier or harder for people to vote? Is it bringing more people in or keeping more people out? It's a very simple question that is usually very easily answered. The second question is the new reform giving more people an equal voice, or is it giving some people a greater voice than others? And that's how it relates to gerrymandering and redistricting, the division of Senate seats, et cetera. Money in politics. These are the kinds of reforms that we need to be considering, because it alters the weight of people's votes, the weight of people's beliefs. And so we just want a democracy that can stay true to involving the most people possible and giving everyone, no matter what their racial background is, religious background, how much money they make, how tall they are, the same voice inside of a democracy.
Thank you.
Those are really excellent comments from both Representative Delaney and Dr. Gest. I would just add to the specific question about voting lines. There's a whole academic subdiscipline called queuing theory that helps us understand how and why lines form and how long they get and how long it takes to get through a line that we can apply to polling places. And so it turns out you need to know three things in order to understand how long a line is going to be. The first is how many people are coming to vote at what rate. So what's the arrival rate of people voting? So knowing something about like the peak voting times on election day and stuff like that is helpful. Second, how long does it take people to go through the process of voting? So like literally, how long does it take to fill out the ballot, to check in and to fill out the ballot? Fortunately, in Virginia, we don't have a very long ballot this year. And so that may help keep our lines a little bit shorter relative to some other states where they've got more stuff on the ballot. And then the third thing is when things go wrong, because things always go wrong in situations like this, how is it handled? Does it create a bottleneck in the system for if one person's signature doesn't match or they're having trouble checking in or whatever, how is that handled at the point in time? Is it handled in such a way that it makes the line back up, or is that person set aside and given a different procedure where their problem can be troubleshooted with a different set of personnel? And those three basic factors that come from queuing theory can help us understand how to design polling places to be the most efficient possible and to hopefully keep the lines down. Mr. Scott can probably speak to the actual specifics in Fairfax County more appropriately.
Well, with respect certainly to the lines we've been seeing, and we have been seeing, initially when we opened our additional satellite locations on the 14th of October, we saw lines, and part of that was due to nervousness. We had a lot of new people doing this for the first time, and so there was a little shaking down that needed to be done. There was also the problem that everyone decided they wanted to be the first in line. So part of that, and I don't know if this is part of the queue theory, but the reality is if you start off with 500 people in line, you're always going to have a 2-hour wait because that line is going to be considerably replenished. Here at the Government Center on the first day when we opened on September the 18th, the wait was about 2 hours. And we finished up, we closed at 4:30 and the last person voted a little after 6:30. And we voted just over 1,100 people here during that period of time. Yesterday, we voted just under 1,800 people in a slightly longer period of time. And we closed at 7 o'clock on the dot because we didn't have 300 people standing in line when we opened. We had 50 people standing in line, but the line continuously replenished all day. And that's what we've been seeing at the satellites. And in areas where we have a lot of people show up at the beginning, you have lines and there's no way to get around that. One of the unfortunate consequences of COVID is we're restricted in the facilities we use. A room can only be so small. And we can only put so many people in that room at a given time. And we have the same obligation to protect the health of our workers as we do to protect the health of the voters coming in. So where in 2016, in the main room of the Government Center where we do voting, where at one time we may have had 12 people in the room at any given time trying to vote, we can have 6. Because we can't set up as many check-in stations, we can't have as many voters in at the same time, and that slows everything down. It's regrettable, but it's part of the world we live in right now. And we're fortunate here at the Government Center that we do have, we were able to take over extra space, and at a couple of the satellites we were. A lot of the facilities, people don't realize when we're setting up the polling places, we have to cut our cloth to fit the pattern. Many of the facilities that we have to use would not be ideal for use as a polling place. We have very strict criteria on what we use. The first thing we have to ensure is ADA accessibility. We need to make sure everyone who wants to come into that polling place can do it. But then again, we still have schools that we're having to do where we have to, the access to that room may not be the best. We have churches that we use where the room may not be the largest and the parking may be problematic. So there are many things that have to be considered, all of which are going to affect the amount of time a person shows up in line. We talk about moving forward. There's several of us in the registrars community in Virginia who are greatly in favor of adopting the West Coast model and going to an all-male election. The startup would be expensive and it would take several years to implement, but the results can't be argued with. Those states who have gone to all-male elections have seen an increase in participation. And that is our goal, is to increase the participation. And in many respects, it's much more efficient. But because it can be spread out over a longer period of time and you're not looking at election day. You're looking at a day when you count all of the ballots, but you're not looking at a day when everyone's trying to vote. And there are many of us who would favor that, knowing that it's going to be an uphill climb. Many years ago, we went to some training and they indicated all significant changes in the way people vote originate on the West Coast and work their way east. And that's exactly what we're seeing with by mail voting. And hopefully within the next few years, Virginia will be able to implement something like that. That doesn't preclude people from showing up in person and casting votes, but you can't really argue with results, and going to all mail voting does increase participation. That's my plug for that, by the way.
Thank you so much. Now, I know I said that that was going to be the last question, but one more question came into the chat and I want to be able to get to it. Dr. Victor, you were able to put in the link for Democracy Squad. So thanks so much for that. But the question is, how do I get involved? How do I, if I'm interested in doing anything, how do I get involved? And maybe folks can sort of, our panelists can drop some things in the chat for folks that are still here, either websites or information that you might know for folks to either get involved, helping to increase the vote, particular political or issues that that might be passionate to folks. Anybody want to share something, as we've got just 3 more minutes before we head out?
In 3 seconds, just ask. Just go. No one's going to come to you. It's not going to be on a silver platter. Just go do it yourself. You know, just ask. Ring people up. Send them an email, tweet at them, say, how can I help? Believe me, everyone's looking for help right now.
Yeah. Join your local political party. They're organizing activities. If you like a certain political candidate, they've got offices, they've got staff. Just give a call. And there's lots of ways to get involved. You're not going to get turned away.
Yeah, I would agree with all of that. Just find the organizations or the candidates or the parties that are intriguing to you or that feel most important to you, and go to their websites and click volunteer. They're all looking for help right now. There's some opportunities on Democracy Squad, but there's a lot more out there. So
yeah. So get involved, call someone, tweet someone. I want to thank all of our panelists, Delegate Delaney, Dr. Gest, Dr. Victor, Gary Scott. Thank you so much for being here and for this awesome, awesome conversation. Thank you to our attendees for showing up, asking questions, joining us on a Thursday evening where there's actually not much to do anyways, but we're so happy that you joined us. Thank you so much. And we will see you at the next Pizza and Perspectives. Have a good night, everyone.
Thank you.
Really nicely done.